Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you on the final day of Tata Literature Live 2020, the 11th annual Mumbai International Literature Festival and the first one to be completely digital. Our thanks to our title sponsor Tata and our co-sponsors Tata Steel and Tata Projects. This session is presented by Hikal. Welcome to a very special session this afternoon, Living with Leonardo, 4 episodes exploring the genius of DaVinci, a straight talk by Martin Kemp. I'll start by quoting Leonardo himself. It had long since come to my attention that people of accomplishment rarely sat back and let things happen to them. They went out and happened to things. Today, the term genius is bandied about to describe just about anyone, but Leonardo da Vinci earned that title. From iconic paintings, the Mona Lisa and the Last Supper, to designs for flying machines and groundbreaking studies on optics and perspectives, Leonardo fused science and art to create works that have become part of humanity's story. And to help us explore his genius further this afternoon, it's my absolute honor and pleasure to introduce to you today's person of accomplishment, Martin Kemp. Martin Kemp has been a professor of history of art at St. Andrews University and the University of Oxford. His 30-plus books include The Science of Art, The Human Animal in Western Art and Science, Christ to Coke, and more recently, Leonardo's Salvator Mundi, Leonardo by Leonardo, and of course today's book, Living with Leonardo. In 2021, he is publishing Heavenly Visions, Dante and the Art of Divine Light. Remember, you too can be an important part of this session by contributing your questions in the chat boxes or comment panels of the platform that you are watching us on. Remember to keep those questions coming in along with your name, and we'll field them to Professor Kemp as soon as his presentation is over. So, presenting this afternoon, Living with Leonardo, 4 episodes exploring the genius of Da Vinci by Martin Kemp. Over to you, Mr. Kemp.
Thank you for the very kind introduction. When I received the invitation to the Tata Mumbai Literary Festival, I thought this is excellent. This will give me a chance to visit India, which is one of my lifelong ambitions, as it was the ambition of my late mother. But of course, I'm not visiting India other than electronically. So I'm talking to you from my office at home, and you're in all sorts of different places. Anyway, welcome to this. And maybe next year with the Dante book, the Divine Light and Dante book, maybe I can catch another invitation and actually come back in person, which would be really special. The book is not an autobiography. It's an account of very extraordinary episodes in my dealings with Leonardo. And when I started as a scholar in Renaissance studies and in French art and so on, I didn't dream where Leonardo would take me. Now I've selected just 4 episodes to get some sense as to how incredible it is, both joyous, enlightening and uplifting, but also sometimes frustrating and sometimes rather antagonistic, as you will see. Anyway, the first incident, next slide, please. The slide seems not to be moving on my screen anyway. Yep, thank you. The story begins with my going up from a state school, provincial background, to Downing College at Cambridge to do natural sciences. I wasn't studying humanities. I played a lot of sport, mainly hockey. And I didn't do a great deal of work in natural sciences, but I had a fantastic education from fellow undergraduates. John Cleese, who may be known to some of you through Monty Python and various other comedy films, did the college cabaret. Trevor Nunn, later director of the Royal Shakespeare Company, was producing plays. I didn't know these people were any good, but I was completely taken over by what my fellow undergraduates could do, and I spent my time catching up. I moved from natural sciences into 1 year of art history and went on to do graduate work. Next, please. I went on to do graduate work at the Courtauld Institute in London. There were 2 great institutes in London, both part of the London University, that were dealing with visual images. The Courtauld Institute, which was art history, pure and simple, or not very simple, but pure anyway. And this is the building we were in at that point. This is Home House, built by Robert Adam, the great 18th century architect, and was a pretty posh place. Having been to Cambridge, of course, I was prepared for this. On the right is the Warburg or Warburg Institute, which left Germany. It was set up by A.B. Warburg, the German banker, Jewish banker, who escaped before the war and before the Hitler regime could do its worst, and moved to London, where it was. They put up a 1950s building for it, which is anything but stylish. So the ethos of these two places is very different. I felt more at home on the whole in the Warburg Institute. Next slide, please. And indeed, the character of these two places was embodied in their directorships. On the left, Sir Ernst Gombrich, Viennese Jewish, very brilliant, head of the Warburg Institute or Warburg, and Anthony Blunt, both knighted. This is Sir Anthony Blunt, head of the Courtauld Institute, aristocratic, keeper of the Queen's pictures. There she is with the Queen, and an authority on, not least on Poussin. Terrifically different men. Blunt, it turned out, and we more or less knew this when we were at the Courtauld in the early 1960s, was spying during the war for the Soviet Union. He was part of a group of communist homosexuals in Cambridge who were recruited into the services. So Gombrich, on the other hand, lived a very simple life. Somebody who had great allegiance to what the Germans call Kulturgeschichte or Kulturwissenschaft, the history of culture, or the science of culture. And I was very much drawn to that because it gave me a sense that science and all the other cultures were not part of segregated areas of knowledge. Gombrich comes into the picture very directly because it explains how I got into Leonardo. I'd kept clear of him. He looked rather big and difficult. And I was asked by a young filmmaker who was a trainee at the BBC if I would help him with his trainee TV program. He'd obviously asked the big figures. He'd asked Gombrich and all the other big names. I'd just finished graduate work, so I was right down the bottom of the pile. Anyway, I said I'd help him with his idea of doing a program on Leonardo and on Leonardo's water drawings, of all things. Next slide, please. I'm not sure why he got into the water drawings, but he said, I'm going to make a program on these very remarkable drawings, of which you see one of the most complicated and brilliant. And he'd managed to get the loan of an unpublished paper by Ernst Gombrich called The Form of Movement in Water and Air. Now, I was then in Glasgow University, and I started reading this paper, and I thought, I know what's happening here, because he explained that these miraculous drawings are both observation and very theoretical. They're based upon Leonardo's interpretation of medieval dynamics. So there was an interplay of science, theory, and observation, which I found, trained in science, I felt much at home with. And I thought, let's get going on Leonardo. So I thought, where do I begin with Leonardo? Next, please. The obvious place to begin as somebody with natural sciences is actually with Leonardo's anatomical drawings. I felt as a biologist, I had some sort of line into these. So I went through all the literature and all the notes and everything on the anatomical drawings, and centered particularly upon these very fascinating drawings. This is the first complete set of Leonardo's drawings that survived for the skull in 1489. And he undertook these remarkable observations. He's doing a schematic vertebral column, but the rest of the skull is amazingly well observed and sectioned. Nobody had done this, to give a 3D view of the skull, sectioning to show the cavities of the skull, the interior shape. So brilliant bits of anatomy. But when I read the notes, I realized that what he was really aiming at was to understand the container for the brain, and indeed the brain itself. And I got a sense that there was a link, not an obvious link, between these skull drawings And next slide, please, the Last Supper. It didn't seem all that obvious, other than the fact that if you're portraying heads, it might help a bit to know what the skull looks like. But I found there was a deeper level of engagement between these anatomical researches, where he's looking at the brain, and the Last Supper. Next slide, please. And it relied upon what Leonardo called il concetto dell'anima, the purpose of the mind or soul. And I was able to make a link across between these skull drawings and the drawing there on the right for St. James the Greater in the Last Supper, the disciple who's throwing out his hands sideways. And the link goes as follows. At the same time as doing those skull drawings, he was also sectioning the brain. He had no sense of what the interior anatomy of the brain was, which is incredibly difficult. It's a soft, gooey mess. And he adopted a traditional pattern whereby the thoughts, the mental processes, were thought to occur in the ventricles, these three chambers in the brain. And the first one close to the eye, which was the superior sense, the first one close to the eye was the imprensiva, the receptor of impressions. The second was the engine room. That's where imagination, intellect, indeed the soul, and all the main mental faculties occurred. And the last one at the end is memory. And he sees this as an input-output system. You take in sensory impressions and you give out movements and reaction. So if you think that Christ is saying to the disciples, one of you will portray me, this is the input and output system that lies behind the Last Supper. The third slide there from the left is a very schematized drawing. He knows it's schematized. He doesn't think it actually looks like this, of the vertebral column in the neck and upper torso. And he's looking at the system of hollow nerves, as they're thought to be, that are communicating in this input and output system. And he writes on this drawing, this demonstration, dimostrazione in Italian, is as necessary to good draftsmen as is the derivation of Latin words for the good grammarian. Next slide, please. So that if you look at the drawing for St. James, which I've collaged there onto the top of this schematic vertebral column, and you look in the Last Supper, there is a dynamic input and output reaction. Now you may say, does the artist need to know this? Leonardo's answer is the artist needs to know exactly how everything works. He's setting the ambition absolutely incredibly high. Anyway, that's how I got into it. That's my first episode, and the revelation that we may say painting is an art and anatomy is a science, but for Leonardo, they're part of a single shared common body of knowledge. Something I think we can learn from today. Next slide, please. And if we look into the Last Supper, we can see this amazing characterization of the figures. Christ himself. The Last Supper very badly deteriorated. It's painted in an experimental technique on a wall, which hasn't survived all that well, but we still get glimmers of what is going on. Christ on the right, and the morascally Judas, who is about to betray Christ, shown with an unpleasant profile and rather unflatteringly. So he's using the science of physiognomics, as it was, of facial features to emphasize the character as well as the dynamic movement of the people according to the motions of the mind or soul. Next, please. We can get quite a good idea of how this was intended from Leonardo's red chalk drawing for Judas on the left, and a drawing by a pupil, Boltraffio, on the right. Very beautiful copy, I think, of a Leonardo drawing. And this gives an idea of the extraordinary potency with which he could render emotion, based in part upon this research into the anatomy and physiology of the human figure. Next, please. The second episode is much more recent one, is the Salvator Mundi. The picture which was sold for a massive sum of money. Next, please. For no less than 450 million, actually a bit more if you add up the whole lot, but that's a rounded figure. And of course, if something's by Leonardo, it attracts an enormous amount of attention. If it's 450 million pounds worth of a work of art, which is just incredible, it attracts even more attention. And I became deeply involved in it. And as you heard, with two colleagues, with Margaret Delaval and Robert Simon, who was one of the discoverers of the Salvator Mundi, we've written a book on that. Next, please. We knew that Leonardo had planned a composition of the Salvator Mundi. On the top right and left are two very beautiful red chalk drawings by Leonardo for the sleeves. The sleeve on the left is not totally as in the picture, but it's clearly studied for it and appears in one or two of the copies. And the one on the right is for the gathered drapery, these rivulets of drapery coming down from the neckband. And we had a whole lot of versions. None of these versions were by Leonardo; they simply weren't good enough. But it's clear that we have the drawing and we have all these copies. Did Leonardo paint one in his own right? Some of the copies are fairly horrible. Next, please. This one was in the Cook collection, and it's one of the least attractive of them, and I called it the drug-crazed hippie. And didn't really, I knew a photograph of it, but didn't really look at it carefully. But this, believe it or not, is the picture we now know, heavily overpainted. Next, please. And this is what it looked like when it was stripped down. It was bought at a New Orleans auction by two New York dealers, Robert Simon and Alexander Parrish. Simon, one of the people who we wrote the book with. And they saw it in an auction catalogue and they got a colour slide of it. And they thought, well, it's probably a decent copy and it's clearly been overpainted, so let's see what we've got. They didn't dream at all that this was going to be what it turned out to be. They took it to Diane Modestini, a very brilliant restorer in New York, a conservator, and she stripped off all the overpaint, and that's what you see there now. With just what is left of Leonardo. You may think, oh, God, that's an awful wreck, that's terrible. But in fact, if you saw in our major galleries all the pictures cleaned right down with no infilling, no retouching, you'd be surprised. These are 500-year-old objects, so they have suffered a good deal. It's not the worst I've seen, and it's not as nice as one would like. But anyway, Diane Modestini didn't overpaint any of Leonardo's paintings, but simply filled in the gaps, as it were. Next, please. And achieved a unified result, which was very striking. And during the course of the restoration, they suddenly began to think, well, what we've got here is not a decent copy, but it could well be the original. Next, please. My entry into the story here comes in 2008 in March. I get a phone call from Nicholas Penny, the director of the National Gallery in London, saying, we've got something here that I think you'd like to look at. And you don't refuse that kind of invitation. So I went up to London, went into the conservator's studio, into their laboratory, and this is what I saw. The Virgin of the Rocks in the National Gallery, which was being considered for cleaning for the Leonardo show that they were then planning, and the Salvator Mundi on an easel. It looks too big there because of perspective, but I walked in and immediately there was a sense that the picture had an air. It's what the later Russian owner called a vibration, but you don't want to get carried away. So I said, there were three other Leonardo scholars there, plus National Gallery staff. And I thought, keep calm. And I kept calm. I got out my magnifying glass, which makes me look professional, and had a look at it. And I thought, don't believe it. Don't get carried away. If you want to get carried away, you see what you want to see. So I tried to retain that level of distance from it. And at the end, I said to Robert Simon, after we had dispersed, I would like to research that. Not to prove it's Leonardo, not to authenticate it, but just to research it and the Salvator Mundi as a composition, as a Leonardo creation. Next, please. It was exhibited in 2011 at the National Gallery exhibition, which was the most heavily pressed, heavily popular exhibition I think ever staged anywhere in the world with art. Enormous numbers of people. Tickets were selling on the black market. They were selling for more than Bruce Springsteen concerts, which gives you an idea. And here, in a typical British winterish day, people queuing uncomfortably outside from sort of 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning. It's amazing what people will do to see Leonardo. No other artist has attracted anything like this. Next, please. It was still in the hands at that stage of then 3 New York dealers. They had come to own the picture and were thinking of selling it. And via Sotheby's, they sold it to the Russian oligarch who made his money not least through fertilizer, Dmitry Rybolovlev on the left, who bought the picture. He's a major collector, collecting Modigliani and a whole lot of major artists. And he bought it from Yves Bouvier, who owned a whole lot of what are called free ports. These are free storage facilities where people can buy pictures free of tax, mainly in Switzerland, but also around the world. Anyway, Bouvier paid over $100 million for it, but then sold it to Rybolovlev at a $50 million markup. Rybolovlev got wind of this huge markup and took legal action against Yves Bouvier for deception and for falsely promoting this enormous markup on the picture. The legal battle, as happens with very rich people with access to the court, is still going on. But Rybolovlev was sufficiently unsettled by all this that he decided to sell his collection, including the Salvator Mundi, at Christie's. Next, please. And at Christie's, it was auctioned and went for, as we saw, for $450 million, by far the most expensive picture. Or I think it's probably right to say it's not the price for a picture, it's a price for Leonardo. It's a price for buying into this great construction of this universal genius. So it takes it out of the world of art into some kind of other realm. The initial indication was it had gone here, which is the very brilliant Louvre branch in Abu Dhabi, built by John Nouvel. I think probably the best modern museum building I've seen anywhere, with major works from the Louvre, and Abu Dhabi are buying works. And the story was it had gone here and was going to be shown in Louvre Abu Dhabi. I thought, excellent. It's now in the public domain. It will be available for sale, for people to see, not for sale, I hope, and would be duly researched, etc., etc. But this proved not to be the case. Who has the picture now? It's been suggested that Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia, has it. I haven't seen absolutely concrete evidence of that. And if I'm asked, as I'm asked a lot, where is the picture now? I simply don't know. And I've not been convinced that anybody else who is pronounced on this knows where it is. So it's disappeared. £450 million worth of picture evaporated, which is rather serious. I mean, these are great works, as was said in the introduction. They're part of humanity's great achievements, and surely they shouldn't have disappeared in this way. And there we are. That's how we are at the moment. I'm still hoping within a day, maybe a year, we will hear where this is, that it's safe and it's being looked after, and that it's available for all of us to see. Next, please. There's been a lot of controversy as to whether it is actually by Leonardo at all, but let's just pick up a few bits of evidence. So first of all, there is a pentimento, that's to say, Italian word for change of mind. The thumb of the blessing Christ was originally rather straighter. Diane Modestini has taken out the second thumb when she was restoring it. It came up during cleaning. Now, you may say that's pretty small, but all the versions we know have the tucked-in thumb. So it's not conclusive, but it does suggest that Leonardo is maneuvering to the painter is maneuvering to the final version. Next, please. And there are other very characteristic signs of Leonardo's hand at work. Not only is the hair, the curls, these vortex curls very brilliantly presented, they also reflect Leonardo's theory, and he has theories about the form of everything. On the right is a drawing of water in motion past a stake in a stream, creating these extraordinary tangles of hair like the manes or tails of a horse. And Leonardo writes precisely that. He says, note how the movement of water is like the curling of hair. You've got the weight of the water and the direction of the direction of the current of the water, the weight of the hair, and you've got the curling motion. You put these two together and you get a helix. So he's got a theory for how hair curls and how water curls. None of the copyists really understand this. And if you look at Leonardo's hair, it has a structure, it has a kind of, it's a science of hair curling, which nobody else gets. Next, please. And most remarkably, he turns the sphere. The Salvator Mundi is the savior of the world. That's what it means in Latin. Normally, they hold, one way or the other, a sphere which is the earth. Leonardo's sphere doesn't look like the earth. It's made of rock crystal. It's got lots of little air inclusions in it, little bubbles, as it were, though they're not quite bubbles, but spaces. And on the right is a piece of rock crystal I bought in a shop, which shows something of these. And on the left is a detail of the sphere, very badly eroded, but you can see it's rock crystal. What that then means, it's not just a whim, is that the mundus, the world, becomes an image of the cosmos, because the cosmology at the time said that there was a crystalline sphere of the fixed stars which lay outside the finite universe. So Leonardo characteristically is elevating the Salvator from savior of the world to savior of the cosmos. These things to me indicate this is Leonardo. It's been damaged, it's been restored, but it's absolutely by him. Next, please. And it also corresponds to some of his optical theories. He's working on incredibly complicated theories of the eye at this time. This is a manuscript in France from 1508, and I won't go through the technicalities of it, but he decides that seeing is such a complicated business that the eye does not definitely know the edge of any body, as he writes. So this softness in the Salvator Mundi is based upon Leonardo's optics, which in turn were founded by Islamic optics by Ibn al-Haytham, translated into Latin. And next, please. And this softness, this ambiguity, this sense that we can't quite see what we're looking at, relates to the theology of the image. He writes at one point, leave the definition of the soul to the minds of the friars, fathers of the people, who by inspiration know the secrets. Let be the sacred books, because they are the supreme truth. So this picture, and it's a late picture, and the St. John the Baptist signal the otherworldly nature, the ultimate inaccessibility of the spiritual domain, which Leonardo believed in. He could believe that we could understand God through nature, but we couldn't understand God as a spiritual being by contemplation, that this was beyond the scope of the human mind. Next, please. The third episode is a drawing on vellum. It's in ink and chalk on vellum, which is parchment. It's animal skin, either sheep or goat skin, of a very beautiful young lady who I christened La Bella Principessa, the beautiful princess. We now know almost certainly that it's Bianca Sforza, who was the illegitimate daughter of the Duke of Milan, Ludovico Sforza, but we didn't know that when we first started looking at it. This has proved to be very controversial, and I'm an art historian. I'm not very young. I do scholarly work, and yet I suddenly got drawn into a world of abuse. Next, please. With a colleague, Pascal Cott, who did the scientific examination, I wrote a book on what I then called La Bella Principessa. And it's extraordinary what happens on the internet. I live a life with a certain amount of public communication, but I'm not a public figure. And somebody wrote on the internet, the science you cite is nothing more than a pompous and confusing and unverifiable rubbish signifying nothing but your skill in manipulating digital images to support your case, and further proof of pathological liars and sociopaths at work. Very extraordinary. And there was more of that. This was actually from an art dealer in America who had a Leonardo drawing that I declined to attribute to Leonardo. Could you skip over the next slide, please? And I'll have 2 slides on. Yes, skip that one. Thank you very much. The case for it being Leonardo and us knowing what it is almost an open and closed book, which is probably appropriate for this slide. At the time of the book, we didn't know where it came from. The drawing has stitches down the left-hand edging, and an American scholar, David Wright, suggested that it might come from a book in Warsaw, which was a presentation book for the marriage of Bianca Sforza to Galeazzo Sanseverino, the commander of Duke Ludovico's forces. So he went off with the National Geographic film crew, who paid for the whole trip. We went off to look to see if the drawing had come out from the volume. The volume itself tells the story of Francesco Sforza, the Duke's father, and is very brilliantly illuminated by an illuminator called Birago. And on the left is a title page. What's going to be difficult for you to see on your screens, but is visible in a big image, is the little charade at the bottom of the slide with a Moorish figure, a dark figure, seated on a stone pedestal. This is Ludovico il Moro. He was called Ludovico the Moor because he had a dark complexion. And on the extreme left, a young man is rushing in, introducing a Moorish girl, a girl with brownish features, with blonde hair. This is Bianca Sforza. This is Bianca, the daughter of Il Moro. So this is designed to celebrate their marriage. There's a tragic element to this, that she made this good marriage having been legitimized, made this marriage the commander of Leonardo's forces, and within 3 months she had died, I think, as a result of an ectopic pregnancy. So this book, in a sense, became a memorial. But you can see the image fits in there absolutely snug. And I'm absolutely convinced it comes from the book. This is in the National Library in Warsaw. They were rather reluctant to countenance this because it seemed to be shameful to think it was cut out of their volume. But of course it was not cut out. In their time, it was cut out probably in the early 19th century when people were collecting these images from manuscripts. Next, please. But this doesn't stop people from saying it's not by Leonardo. A rather skillful forger from Preston called Sean Greenhalgh had written a book about his life. He was creating a whole series of forgeries. The bottom one is supposedly a faun by Gauguin, and he was selling them via his parents, who provided a cover. They claimed to have owned these things and were selling them off, though they lived in a rather humble house in Preston. Not, of course, that I'm being rude about Preston. Anyway, Greenhalgh tacked on to the end of his book a claim that he had faked the Bella Principessa, faked the portrait of Bianca Sforza, with no grounds at all. And in fact, next please, we had access to a technical report with an Italian laboratory that used a technique called gamma ray spectroscopy. I won't explain what it is, but basically white lead, which is used as the standard white in Renaissance painting, it's synthetically made from lead dioxide, and it undergoes a gamma ray deterioration. And if you examine the white lead and it's got no radiation left, it means that in this case the white lead is more than 250 years old. So I won't go into the technicalities of that, but perhaps you'll trust me. And obviously, if the white lead is used 250 years old, it can't be by a modern forger. Greenhalgh, however, claimed he had made his own pigments from organic materials of an appropriate age, including iron-rich clay he dug up and charcoal from ancient trees. It's not an organic pigment, but this got a great deal of traction in the press because And if you can prove that a supposed Leonardo is a forgery, it's big news. Next, please. What's happened to the Bella Principessa, to the Bianca Sforza? It's still in private hands and is uneasily in limbo. It's been exhibited various places. This is it arriving in Japan. This looks, doesn't it, like an episode out of Star Wars. And these pictures have enormous security attached to them. And speaking of Star Wars, next slide, please. In the company of Darth Vader, this means that the Bianca Sforza is beginning to get some traction in the popular domain. It's very, very odd. And all the time I reflect on where Leonardo has taken me, and to see a young Milanese prince in conversation with Darth Vader seems a very odd thing to happen to an art historian. Next, please. And there it is. I think it's very beautiful. A bit damaged, but basically, and I'm confident it will survive and it will emerge as a very beautiful small-scale Leonardo portrait. Next, please. My final episode is of two Madonna paintings, which had lurked on the edge of Leonardo. They were thought to be copies. The one on the left is in the collection of the Scottish aristocrat, the Duke of Buccleuch. The one on the right is in a private collection, a very secret private collection, and normally called Private Collection New York, which is what we'll have to do with. Now, we've got two versions of this and lots of other versions, but these are the two best ones. And the question is one of them Leonardo? If so, which one? Or neither of them by Leonardo? The one on the left, as I say, is in a Scottish collection. Next slide, please. Of the Duke of Buccleuch, who lives in this absolutely wonderful Renaissance castle, late 16th century castle in the Scottish borders called Drumlanrig Castle, owned by Johnny, the Duke of Buccleuch, who had a riding accident, confined to a wheelchair, but as a man of enormous figure. And I went with a group from St Andrews University to look at the architecture. It's an important Scottish baronial building related to French chateau. Anyway, while there, we obviously looked at the major art collection. Hardly any Leonardo scholars had been to the Scottish borders to look at this. So people were relying upon photographs. And I looked at it in the original, and I thought, this actually bears looking at. Again, I didn't jump to conclusions, but I thought it was worth examining it. And we took it to the National Gallery of Scotland and gave it a technical examination. Next, please. And in the middle there, you see the infrared reflectogram. This bombards the picture with infrared rays safely, I have to say. And if you're lucky, it will penetrate to the white priming, the plaster priming of the panel, and will reflect back carbon-rich pigments, an underdrawing. What we got out, it's very difficult to see on the level of a computer screen, is an arch on the left of the Virgin as you look at it, with a little figure group with heads and so on. It's difficult to distinguish, I know, for the spectators, but rather remarkably, the National Gallery of Scotland had a rather poor version of the picture, and you can see to the left of the Virgin, you can see this group clarified. What's going on? Joseph, who was a carpenter, is making a wooden baby walker on these frames for babies to toddle around in. And an incredible coincidence, it happened to be in store in Edinburgh, and we mounted an exhibition of both versions of the Madonna, the Yarnwinder, and of the technical examination. Next, please. We looked also closely at the New York private collection version. This has been transferred from panel onto canvas and then back onto panel. So there's a lot of paint loss, and it looks very different, but it's actually a superficial difference of condition from the Duke of Buccleuch's picture, which is in good condition but hasn't been cleaned. This, on the other hand, has been cleaned. And at some point, the child's genitals have been cleaned off or at least they've been covered over with overpaint and then cleaned off. So it's not in the same condition. But next, please. What we found when we looked with infrared reflectography at the New York version, we found the same group, but slightly more elaborately with a little awning, a cantilevered awning above the arch, but that same figure group there. We found lots of changes in the Yarnwinder, this cross-shaped object, which symbolized the crucifixion. We found lots of strings of wool about to be wound, which were hanging off, which are not visible in the final picture. So what happened here is that we've got very remarkable evidence, almost the first time ever, of two pictures being generated side by side in the studio, with Leonardo making changes. Probably the boys, the assistants, come in and paint various bits of the picture, small-scale devotional picture. But we've got evidence of Leonardo's creative procedures going back and forth from one picture to the other, which is a very remarkable finding. Next, please. Then in 2003, the picture was stolen. Thieves early in the morning, just after John Lamerick had opened, overpowered a guard and ripped the picture out of its box, its protective box, and stole it. This, of course, was a major sensation, Leonardo being stolen. The police asked me, if we recover the picture, how will we know it's the original? And I said, I've got unpublished evidence of the underdrawings. I hadn't published all that at this time, and no thief would know about this. So if we do a scientific examination when it's recovered, then we can say it's Leonardo. Next, please. And after 4 years, the Scottish police worked on this very brilliantly and assiduously, and they set themselves up as loss adjusters and set up an office to try and contact the thieves, which they did. And they managed, and it's a long story, to recover it after 4 years. The Duke sadly died a month before it was due to be, before they knew it had been recovered. This is me arriving in Edinburgh in the National Gallery conservation studio to see the picture. You've got members of the Dumfries and Galloway Constabulary, the policemen and the staff of the National Gallery Conservation Department. I don't think I need tell you which is which. Anyway, joyously it was recovered, and we did scientific examination, and we could show the underdrawing, much more of it, in fact, and say to the police, yeah, we've got the original thing. Next, please. Anyway, with Leonardo, you never know where you're going to end up. I get involved in controversies. Should the Mona Lisa be cleaned? On the right is a very brilliant digital restoration based upon pigment analysis by Pascal Cotte, I wrote the Mona Lisa book with. I personally, the Mona Lisa is such a complex, fragile, and difficult object technically. I think I would leave Mona Lisa and I would do a digital restoration. Anyway, those are the 4 episodes, and there are other episodes in the book, and it is amazing to find that the quiet life of an Oxford professor doing art history has taken into these extraordinary public realms. Thank you very much.
Right, Mr. Kemp, we'll go over to the Q&A. We have had a whole barrage of questions, and we've got a lot of people with a whole bunch of different queries. So we'll start off with the first one by Prashanti. They ask, how do we preserve and encourage DaVinci's way of marrying art with science, especially with the advent of photography and digital media? Or will art styles like DaVinci's inevitably be lost?
This is a very straightforward question, but incredibly difficult. We're dealing with very different historical circumstances. In Leonardo's age, you could stand some chance of mastering quite a number of disciplines was the body of material isn't so big. I still take Nature, the science magazine, on subscription, and the sheer volume of stuff is just awesome. And much of it over the years has become incomprehensible to me. So that's a difficulty. But I think the principle is that no discipline is adequate to itself. Any discipline that becomes, to use a rather loaded word, a ghetto, draws fences around it by jargon and so on, is missing a chance to develop in itself, but also to prevent a sense of the wholeness of knowledge. And I think the historian has a role to play in this, because I can say Leonardo relies on extraordinary lateral thinking, that he can look at air and water, and we think they're completely different regimes physically, and see the commonality between them. And I think whatever discipline we're in, it is always good to break out from the boundaries of that discipline, both for public understanding, which is incredibly important in this age of extraordinary supreme complexity, but also for the subject itself. DNA, for instance, by Watson and Crick. You've got Watson, who is a very speculative biologist. You've got Crick, who's an expert in physics and the techniques of examination, X-ray diffraction. So many of these big episodes, not embodied in a single individual anymore, perhaps, but with cross-disciplinary teams. But it is important, if we all remain in our small, limited areas of knowledge, we'll stop talking to each other.
Our next question again is from Prashanti. She asks, is there anyone you see as a contemporary Da Vinci, although no one will come close to his genius? And has there ever been a true successor to Leonardo? If not, do you believe there ever will be?
I think I would duck the question about can I identify a modern Leonardo. I think I need a lot more thought for that. But there are certainly people who aspire to be polymaths, and it's interesting. One or two people, Peter Burke, my colleague as a cultural historian, has just written a book called The Polymaths, and it's amazing how many of the people who do big things in one field, they're not necessarily great experts in another field, but they have a breadth of knowledge, and they're not, as I said before, limited in their one. Sorry, the second part of the question was, can we ever see another Leonardo?
The second part of the question is, do you think there ever will be a true Leonardo?
Not in his terms, for the reasons I've given, but let's pray we can produce a lot of Leonardos who really object to the parceling up of knowledge in these highly professional categories. Full up with jargon, full up with data, full up with jargon. We should resist this compartmentalizing of our knowledge and expertise. It makes us feel comfortable as professionals. Art historians have jargon, but we should try to avoid it.
Right. Sananda asks, what is the role of museums in today's internet-driven world, and how can museums still connect with people and promote engagement with art?
Yeah, the internet's obviously got an enormous role to play, and this has been highlighted obviously by the current crisis, that we can hold a literary festival. A number of museums, galleries are providing a lot enhanced digital access to their collections, some virtual tours and so on. But all the indications have been, not at the moment obviously, where visiting galleries is problematic, that if you increase digital awareness of things and indeed have enormous high resolution images on the net, it doesn't get in the way or discourage people from visiting. If anything, it encourages people who are visiting. The National Gallery National Gallery exhibition, in which the Salvator Mundi was included, that was huge on the internet. But obviously, the cues are people who want to see the real thing, and ultimately, there is a psychological magic in seeing the real thing. Absolutely. But also, these are very complicated objects. There are opaque pigments, translucent pigments. They are cracked. There's yellowed varnish. They are visually very complicated things, and the best reproduction, even textured ones, produce the surface. They don't produce the depth of the object. So I welcome the advent of digital ones. The Dante book I wrote um, I had to use a lot of internet resources because libraries were shut down.
Right.
And I simply couldn't have done that book without a lot of facsimiles, near facsimiles of manuscripts, of drawings, of um, other scholarship being available on the internet. So no, I think it's exciting, and it's a symbiosis, not a competition.
Right. Wonderful. KS from Mumbai asks, would you say Leonardo was more of a scientist than an artist, or did he use his science to achieve perfection in art?
I'd answer that question by stepping aside from it for a bit. He wouldn't quite have recognized, he wouldn't have recognized at all our use of the terms artist and scientist in that modern way. Somebody who does fine arts and creates aesthetic objects, and somebody who does science. He saw them as a unified field. The artist was remaking nature based upon the knowledge of nature. You know, the hair or whatever is remade according to how he conceives hair as working. Um, and there is that sense of unity. People say Leonardo is a polymath. I've been saying um, somewhat anarchically, he's actually a monomath. He sees everything as part of a single field of knowledge and endeavor. And for him, scienza meant systematic body of knowledge. It didn't mean our professional science. It meant a body of demonstrable knowledge based upon philosophy and based upon uh, experience, etc., etc. And arte meant at that time a skill. So, in a sense, he's using his artistic skill to investigate the scienza, the science of nature. So the terms have shifted. If we understand it in terms of how he saw things, then he would say art is a science, and science involves fantasia, imagination. So they're in a sense the same basic human endeavor.
Right. Now, this is a question from Kyle, but it's also one that has been, I've been trying to figure out for the longest time. What is it that makes the Mona Lisa one of the best known paintings in the world and his best known work?
I've spent I've spent a lot of years trying to come up with a succinct answer to that. The book I wrote called How Image Became Christ to Coke, Mona Lisa features in that, and I look at a series of these iconic images, including Christ, including DNA, including E equals MC squared, some science ones as well. And if I had a formula for doing this, I'd be the best advertising man in the world. But it's it's a mixture of being very memorable visually, essentially having enormous recognizability. If you degrade Mona Lisa to a point where it's almost unrecognizable, it still is Mona Lisa. So the image has got to have that succinct power to it. But it's also got to invite the spectator in to suggest worlds of knowledge we can enter. The softening of features in Mona Lisa and her enigma, the fact you can't absolutely define what she is thinking and so on, is part of that. So the iconic images are recognizable, but they also let the spectator go into an imaginary world of further associations. I mean, E equals MC squared can get us into areas, including the atomic bomb, the less fortunate areas, but into the extraordinary nature of time, space, and the revolution. DNA gets us into inheritance. So you need both this magic of the incredibly oppressive image, but you also need to open up the spectator to and the viewer to a series of their own imaginings and their own associations. That's the best I can do. It's not adequate, but it's the best I can do.
So we have a question as a follow-up to your answer. Shireen asks, you teach at Oxford, which is emerging as a cutting-edge vaccine developer. In today's time, which is so focused on science and medicine and the pandemic, how does that compare with any interest in the arts amongst students?
I'm not finding it, obviously, in a sense, it's difficult to say because the student body is now so diverse, so dispersed, and so on. But I don't notice any diminution of interest. And obviously, my local experience is in events like this, where people are still avid, um, and the number of internet things I do, the keenness of publishers to publish books. There are huge queues at the printers. I think the Dante book has got in fairly early, so it's doing okay. So I don't see any diminution of interest in that. And I miss personally audiences. I've been involved in various concerts presenting them, and I've also, of course, listened to lots of things. And it's great having this worldwide dispersed audience, but ultimately it's not the same. And I think that element of the human contact, whether it's with other people or with Leonardo via Mona Lisa, that element of human contact is always going to be vital, however much we digitize and however wonderful it is that ultimately we are thinking emotional beings with communicative souls, and we need that dimension to it. And I think the arts will always continue to provide that, even in these very difficult circumstances.
Right. Nisha asks, are there any other paintings of Leonardo that have disappeared from the public domain?
Not quite in the way the Salvator Mundi has. In fact, I mean, Leonardo painted very few pictures. My count is about 20. It depends on some ones which probably are partly studio paintings. And the most serious loss was a painting of Leda and the Swan, a naked woman, a Spartan princess with the swan, who is Jupiter in one of his many disguises. And that disappeared at some point. It was in the French Royal Collection. It's on panel, and apparently was splitting apart and seems to have disappeared. But generally speaking, I don't think there are lots of Leonardos lurking to be rediscovered, but I thought that when the Salvator Mundi came up. And in that case, of course, we didn't know whether Leonardo had painted a picture of it or whether they were just studio pictures and followers versions. But
right.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if another Leonardo like Salvator Mundi came along. It was the first one for 120 years, but as Leonardo, I've learned never to be surprised.
So we have one last question from Jude Flogdell, who asks, why were two copies of the Madonna of the Yarnwinder produced, and are we able to trace the provenance of both paintings reliably?
Yeah, a good question. In Renaissance Studios, there was a production of small-scale devotional pictures, which I call off-the-peg pictures. Leonardo was commissioned in 1499 by a French aristocrat who was in part of the French invasion of Italy to produce a small painting, the Madonna of the Yarnwinder, as we now know. And Leonardo took advantage that I've got the Robert painting, why don't I and the boys generate a second version which would be saleable? An off-the-peg picture, we think of these things as always commissioned, but the smaller scale devotional works were not. And we saw Leonardo going back and forth. Neither of them have continuous provenances. That would be nice to get out. The Duke of Buccleuch's one was owned by the family in the 18th century, and in the late 18th century, the New York one was owned by the Marquis of Lansdowne, but we can't get them back securely to the original records. We've got early records. We've then got a gap of 150 years or so. But that's so with all Leonardos. The Mona Lisa, we've got a gap in its provenance. The only one with the continuous provenance is the Last Supper, for fairly obvious reasons.
Super. Thank you so much for that really interesting and engaging session, Mr. Kemp. A huge thank you to you, and a huge thank you to our audience out there who sent us such fabulous questions. I guess all our sessions are just as good as the audience that watches it, and you guys have been fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Kemp, for that talk. Our next session in 15 minutes is Rape and the Role of the Media, and at 6 p.m. we have Dreaming Up Multiverses, the Many Dimensions of Neil Gaiman, and of course, our Tata Literature Live award ceremony happens this evening at 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time. So don't miss out on all these sessions coming up. Our festival social media handle across all platforms is at @tatalitlive.in. Huge thank you to our title sponsor Tata, and this session was presented by Hikal. Thank you so much for being here online with us at Tata Literature Live 2020. Stay tuned and stay safe. See you soon back again online.
do